Have you ever been humiliated in the place where you should have been embraced? I'm not talking about a random scolding, a dirty look at the grocery store, a snide comment on the bus. I'm talking about hearing the word that kills you inside, spoken into a church microphone, echoing in front of people who've known you since you were a kid. Old faggot. Just like that, with every letter spat out as if it were a psalm. I was sitting on the same wooden bench where I'd prayed my entire life, where I'd sung hymns, where I'd rocked my grandson in my lap during the children's service. The microphone hissed, the pastor adjusted his tie, and instead of talking about forgiveness, he spoke about me. I didn't shout. I didn't respond. I bit my tongue and stayed. Silence sometimes is the only defense for those who no longer have the strength to fight. I know this word hurts you too. You who are a grown man, white hair, creaking knees, but still carry within your chest a boy who just wanted to be seen without shame. And that's why I came to tell you they called me old gay in the church. And the next day I came back holding hands with him. The church smelled of furniture polish and bottled coffee, as it did every Sunday morning. The sisters in the prayer circle walked by in ankle-length skirts. The deacons arranged chairs. The young men in the choir tuned their keyboards. I was in my corner, as I always had been. I'm a bench player, not a stage player. My faith never needed colored light. I grew up learning that God listens more to the heart than to the throat. But that day my heart was beating too loudly. Before the humiliation, I already felt the cold looks, the weight of the turned back, the hallway whisper. You know when you realize that the service has become a court and the pastor a judge? It was like that. I helped build that temple with my own hands. I painted the wall, I carried bricks, I paid for the lamp, I took basic food baskets for the family that lost everything. In the flood. I have never missed a communion service. When I needed a hug, I found a bank. When I needed a bank, I found a bill. I accepted the accounting of faith. Tithe comes in. Guilt remains. The worst thing isn't what they shout at you. The worst thing is what whisper to themselves. I saw it up close, hypocrisy that runs beneath the pulpit. Moralistic men, tight tie and large Bible, which preach against sin on Sunday, and on Monday they look for jackasses on the avenue, pay callboys in. Applications, they send messages at dawn for the new boy at church. I saw deacon's hand trembling when it's time to play the praise, but hold on tight to your wallet when you open the note for the cheap room. I saw youth leader with a purity project who knows every corner of the night. I saw, and I kept quiet. I kept quiet out of fear. I kept quiet out of habit. I kept quiet thinking that God would only tolerate me if I hid. But that Sunday, when the word came through the microphone and cut me in half, I understood that it was no longer about me. It was about the right to grow old in peace. I worked too much, I cried so much, I lost too much. I wasn't going to miss it either, my dignity. I returned home with a hard chest and a cold hand. I sat on the edge of the bed, looked at the ceiling, at the crooked crucifix on its ancient nail, and asked God informally, "Do you want me as I am, or do you want me dead inside?" The answer came in the silence that does not accuse. I didn't hear. Thunder, no open verse fell. I just felt that breathing without guilt is also a prayer. I wish you, old man like me, would understand this part. It's not about scandal, it's about respect. The word faggot has been with me since I was 17, stuck to the back of my neck, but old was the blade. Because when we get old, the city decides push us into the corner, as if desire had an expiration date, as if kindness was the privilege of a new knee. Two loved a man. It wasn't a night of partying. It was history. It was a conversation on a park bench, hand that calms tremors, eye that understands without asking. He was life that arrived late, but arrived in one piece. Do you want to know how it started? There, inside the church. He played guitar in worship, with the air of someone asking permission even from the air. When he sang, lowered his eyes, not out of shame, but because respect. We recognized each other. Not careful. How to arrange the microphone cable so that no one trips, put away the chair for the most. Tired brother. There was no sin in holding a book together. There was no sin in laughing at the same keyboard stumble. There was peace. And when there is peace, God is not far away. On the day of humiliation, the loud-voiced saints cheered like a crowd. I saw mother covering child's ears, wee teenager taking out his cell phone, wee old brother say amen out of the corner of his mouth. I remained seated. Each hallelujah became a nail in my shoe. Each glory turned dust in my throat. But I did not argue theology. I did not return the insult. I just existed. and sometimes existing for them is already provocation. At home, I didn't sleep. Bitter coffee, slow clock, refrigerator noise. The old body has its noises, but that morning it was the one who snored memory. Childhood of fear, a youth in disguise, you fake dating, a hanging Gilton, the Sunday hanger. I looked in the mirror and saw myself whole, wrinkles that count, eyes that got tired, shoulders that still support, and decide, I'll be back. To go back, not to fight. Return to be. Back to occupy the bench with the body that I have, without inventing a voice, without lowering your head. Get back with him, holding hands, without theatre, no hiding place. Why the church is mine too. Why faith is not the property of whoever shouts the loudest. Why God does not outsource love. You might ask, but what about fear? There was. Fear of stones, of fingers, of laughter, of photos, of videos in the family group. But there was. Something else bigger. Something that a mature man knows. The tiredness of running away. Running away weighs more than getting old. Weeging lightly when drop the suitcase that isn't ours. And that suitcase, the shameful one, I decided to drop out. The next morning I ran my hand over the ironed shirt. I shined the worn shoe, I put on the old bracelet watch. He arrived on time, looked down and smiled small, as someone who knows that each step is a chapter. I offered the hand. He held with respect. No. Rush. Two men's hands, calloused and veined, woven by the same urgency, live without apologizing for existing. The street to the church looked like longer, but I knew every hole. The neighbors looked, some pretended not to see, others gave that wave that has pity and courage mixed together. The sky was clear of thin cloud, the kind we call clothes on the line time. The church gate, painted with old green, was open as always, open to everyone. The sign said, "Welcome." I read twice. On the first step, took a deep breath. I felt the smell of waxed wood, the sound of the keyboard warming up a well-known hymn, the discreet creak of a heavy chair. He looked at me as if asking without words, "And now? You?" I nodded, squeezing his fingers tighter. The hand that held me the night before, now he pulled me into the clearing, and that's when I understood. The greatest sermon of my life wouldn't come out of the mouth, it would come out of the gesture. A hand in a place that always wanted me with clenched fists. An entire presence where they only half accepted me. One step forward where they pushed me back. We crossed the gate. The lobby fell silent. The microphone stopped hissing. Someone dropped a hymnal. The pastor saw us, and before his voice could find another word for me, I had already chosen the bank. The same old bank. 2 hands on the same knee. 2 breaths aligning the same compass. And if you've come this far, breathing every word with me, then you understand that this story, it's not just mine. It belongs to every man who one day kept quiet so as not to lose the little piece he still had. So before you leave the video, write in the comments what this story made you feel. Tell me if you've ever had to pretend to be someone you weren't just to fit in. I want to read your story, your opinion, your truth, because this channel isn't about controversy, it's about real life. And if what I told you today made you think, if it made you remember someone, or if it made you want to reflect on hypocrisy, on the courage to be who you are, then leave your like. It's free, but it really helps get this video to others who need to hear it too. Take advantage and subscribe to the channel so as not to miss the next chapter of this story, because what happened after I entered that church hand in hand with him will still surprise you. Activate the bell and comment below with just one word. Simple but powerful. Respect. Because that's what the world needs, and that's what still gets me up every Sunday. The faith that turned to fear began long before that Sunday. I remember well the first day I stepped into that church, still young, in an ironed shirt and borrowed shoes. I didn't know much about life, but I knew I needed to believe in something, and it was there that I found the first place where someone called me brother. At first it felt like true love. People greeted me with hugs, the pastor said that God's house was for everyone, and I believed. I believed so much that I spent years carrying boxes, painting walls, helping at events, mopping the floor after services. I was always the first to arrive and the last to leave. I did it out of faith, out of habit, but also because there, among so many, I felt part of something. Even though deep down I carried the secret they would call an abomination, I remember praying quietly, asking God to take away what I felt because they said it was wrong. I spent years afraid of myself, thinking that being who I am was a punishment, that loving another man was a cross, and that the more I suffered, the holier I would become. It's funny how religion sometimes teaches us to hate our own souls and still calls it salvation. The fear of being discovered was so great that any lingering touch, any lingering glance would put me on alert. I lived with a heavy heart, like someone walking around with glass in their chest about to shatter. At every service, I expected a word of love, and what came was always a reminder of sin. But time passes, and the body tires of hiding. I was already over 60 when I began to notice the cracks in that family of faith. The same people who spoke of purity used the word brother to disguise the indecent messages they sent to the boys in the worship team. I'd seen too much to keep pretending. I saw a pastor in a suit who preached against hell, but left the church directly to look for boys downtown. I saw a deacon with a wife and children swearing holiness, but who disappeared for 2 days every month, claiming it was a spiritual retreat. And no one said anything. No one saw, or they pretended not to see because it's easier to judge others than to see one's own reflection. And I, who only wanted to live my faith in peace, became the preferred target. All I had to do was smile too much, talk to some new guy, and the whispers would start. Strange old man. I don't trust that one. Have you seen the way he looks? And the saddest thing was that it came from the very person who preached about loving one's neighbor. The church, which should have been welcoming, became the courtroom where I was a defendant every week. One dirty look in the hallway was enough to make my soul shrink. And yet, I returned. I returned because I still believed that one day they would understand that faith and desire are not mutually exclusive, that true love has no gender, but an essence. One day, during a sermon on the sins of the body, the pastor looked directly at me while speaking about those who bring shame to the house of the Lord. His words were cold, sharp, full of venom disguised as holiness. I understood the message. He didn't need to say my name. Everyone else understood too. I felt the eyes of the entire church on me, weighing, measuring, judging. I took a deep breath and remained silent, because I've learned that sometimes silence protects more than words. But inside, something began to change. The faith that once nourished me began to hurt me. I still believed in God, but I no longer believed as much in the people who claimed to represent him. And it's strange to realize this after so long, because I gave my life for that church. I gave my time, my sweat, even my money. And in the end, all I received was the same look they give to those who don't belong. But I belong, even if they don't accept it. Because the God I knew back then, as a child, before I learned fear, was different. He was a God who embraced, who forgave, who saw the heart, not the label. In the days following that public humiliation, I relived every service, every word, every prayer, asking to be different. And the more I remembered, the more I realized that it was never God who rejected me. It was men. They were the same ones who preach on Sunday and sin on Monday, the same ones who use the Bible as a shield to hide their shame. When I discovered this, something inside me was freed, because I understood that the real sin is not loving, but lying to yourself. It was, at that time, that he appeared, the one who reminded me that it was still possible to feel peace without guilt, and I swear, nothing was wrong. It was just conversation, respect, a coffee after the service. But for them, that was enough to light the fire of judgment. A gesture of kindness was enough for them to turn their backs, and it was there, in the midst of distorted faith, that a pure love was born. A love that didn't ask for permission, but also didn't make noise. It was like breathing. After years of holding it, even so, fear still lingered within me, because I knew that all it took was one slip-up, and I'd be subject to a lecture. It was a dangerous game, faith versus instinct, guilt versus the heart, and I played it silently for decades, thinking that one day they'd accept me, that all I had to do was prove I was good, helpful, and devout. But I learned the hard way that, for many people, it doesn't matter what you do if who you are hurts who they pretend to be. Sometimes, I wonder how many men like me are out there, sitting in the back pews of churches, silent, pretending to be just discreet brothers. How many sing hymns while crying inside? How many raise their hands in praise trying to hide the trembling of shame? How many carry guilt that isn't even theirs? And all this because someone said God only listens to the normal. Today I see that fear is a prison built with words of faith, and that the first step to escape it is understanding that there is no true faith when you erase who you are. God didn't create me to be a ghost in my own life. He created me to feel, to make mistakes, to love, and to not ask for forgiveness for it. If you've made it this far, I want you to write in the comments what you feel when you hear someone using religion to humiliate another human being. Write true faith if you believe that love is greater than prejudice. I want to see who understands what I'm saying, who feels this struggle within their heart. And if this passage touched you, leave a like so that more people can hear this story, because there are many people out there who need to understand that God was never synonymous with fear. He was synonymous with love. He appeared on an ordinary morning, the kind when the sun streams through the cracks in the church windows and makes the dust seem like a shimmer. I was sweeping the floor of the hall, as I did almost every day, when I heard the sound of the guitar coming from the back. It was a simple, unhurried touch, the kind you feel in your chest before you understand it in your head. I approached slowly, and there he was, sitting on the front bench, tuning the strings, with the calm gaze of someone who seems to carry peace within. His name was Gabriel, and I swear in that first moment I thought of nothing but admiration. I simply thought it was beautiful to see someone so devoted to music, so in tune with that place that no longer brought me comfort. But life has a curious way of confronting us with the very thing we try to avoid. Because when our eyes met, there was no guilt, no fear, no sin, just a silence that said, "I see you." And being seen, after so long being invisible, is more powerful than any miracle. Over the next few days, I began to notice that he always arrived early for services, checking the sound, arranging cables, jotting down chords in a worn notebook. I found excuses to stop by, to ask if he needed help, to grab a chair. Simple, almost silly things, but they made me feel alive again. Sometimes he'd smile and say yes, other times he'd say no, but always with that calm demeanor, like someone who understands that words matter less than presence. And that's how it began. No dramatic confessions or impossible promises, just two men tired of pretending, finding refuge in routine. Over time our friendship grew, hidden between prayers and rehearsals. Sometimes he'd wait for me outside after church, and we'd walk together to the bus stop. We'd talk about everything, childhood, work, loss, and amidst all that talk there was something that was never spoken but was there, floating between us. It was a kind of love that didn't need explaining, because it was born of recognition. He too carried similar wounds. He too had tried to change. He too knew the bitter taste of guilt. The difference was that, in him, fear hadn't yet become armor. He believed it was possible to be who he was and still believe in God. And hearing that from someone, inside the same church that hurt me, was like opening a window in a room locked decades ago. I remember one Sunday in particular. The service had ended, the church was empty, and the sound of the guitar still echoed off the walls. I sat in the back pew and watched him play. His hands moved slowly, precisely, as if each note were a wordless prayer. At one point, he stopped, looked at me, and asked, "Do you really believe that God doesn't want us to be happy?" It took me a while to answer, because no one had ever asked me that question like that, without judgment, without irony. And when I did, my voice came out hoarse. "I believe that what offends God is not love, but lies." He nodded, put away his guitar, and walked over to me. He sat next to me and remained silent. There was no touching, no confession, just that meaningful silence. And it was then that I understood that love, when it's true, doesn't need an audience. The days passed, and the comments began. First whispers, then glances. The church, which once seemed blind to the sins of others, suddenly saw too much. Just being in the same hallway with him was enough for the air to grow heavy. I heard my name in the interrupted conversations, saw the expressions feigning naturalness. One day, one of the women in the prayer circle stopped me on the way out and said she was praying for me. I thanked her, but I understood the message. They weren't praying for me, but against me. They wanted me to return to being what I'd never been. The weight of the hypocrisy became so great that I began avoiding services, arriving only after the praise began and leaving before the final amen. But he wouldn't let me leave. He said, "God doesn't need you to hide." And maybe that's why I kept going. Not to please others, but to prove to myself that I wasn't going to run away anymore. And the more they tried to erase me, the more I realized the cowardice hidden behind those ties and long skirts. I knew stories I'd never told anyone, of deacons who disappeared in the early hours of the morning, of pastors who paid for what they condemned from the pulpit. I saw it with my own eyes, but always kept quiet. And now they called me immoral, a shameless old man, a bad example. Irony doesn't begin to describe what I felt. One night after a heavy service we left together, and he asked me if I regretted staying there for so long. I looked at him and said no, because the whole thing made me understand the difference between faith and fanaticism. Faith liberates, fanaticism imprisons, and I'd lived imprisoned for too long. That night, it rained heavily. We stood under the church awning, waiting for the rain to pass. The sound of the falling water seemed to wash away the weight of the words I'd never had the courage to say. I looked at him and said, "You know, if they find out, they'll crucify us, right?" He smiled and replied, "They already crucified the only man who preached love. What they would do to us is just repetition." In that simple answer, I found a courage I no longer knew I possessed. Because the truth is, we get tired of apologizing for who we are, tired of carrying the burden of other people's shame, tired of hiding what is pure for fear of impure eyes. And it was there, under that rain, that I decided I was no longer going to live in hiding. I had no more time to waste pretending to be invisible. Life was already too short to keep disguising myself. From that day on, we walked together, at EC, first still disguised, as two long-time friends. But every small gesture carried the weight of courage. Every shared smile was an act of resistance. I knew the time for lies was ending, and if the price of truth was expulsion, so be it. Love, true love, is not a crime. It is testimony. If you've made it this far, write, "Love is a testimony," in the comments. I want to see who understands what it means to resist in silence and still believe. And if this excerpt touched you, leave a like to strengthen this message, because every like helps spread the truth. Love was never a sin. The sin is living in fear of it. As the months passed, the peace I felt with him began to bother others. It was as if the mere fact that we were at peace irritated those who lived on appearances. The church, which had once welcomed me, became a stage for pretense and gossip. I only had to cross the aisle to feel whispers cutting through the air, hands covering mouths, eyes averting when I looked back. The same people who had once called me brother now crossed the street to avoid speaking to me. But the ironic thing is that those holy mouths hid stories far dirtier than any forbidden love could carry. I knew what went on behind the scenes. I knew about the secret dinners, the missionary trips that ended in motels, the married men who disappeared on Fridays and returned renewed on Sunday, ready to shout, "Hallelujah!" I saw, I heard, and I remained silent, because I learned that when you speak the truth in a place accustomed to lies, you are the one who becomes the sinner. And that's when I began to see the rot behind the canned faith they preached every weekend. The same pastor who railed against the flesh had a cell phone full of messages that should never see the light of day. One of the deacons who preached purity sermons was seen every week with different boys outside the subway, and the youth leader, who claimed to struggle with sin, was the same one who would seek me out in the wee hours of the morning, with a trembling voice and barely concealed desire, asking me to pray with him in private. The difference between them and me is that I never lied to myself. I might even be afraid, but I didn't pretend to be holy. They lived in the pulpit with their faces plastered with morality, while their hearts slowly rotted. I remember one night when I arrived to help arrange the chairs for the service and saw a car parked at the back of the church. The lights were off, but the fogged-up windows told more than any confession. I didn't need to see to understand what was happening there, and what hurt most wasn't the betrayal, it was the certainty that the following Sunday, that same man would stand at the altar to speak about repentance. I continued doing what I had come to do, stacking chairs, sweeping the floor, pretending I didn't see anything, because I've learned that in certain places, the truth isn't welcome. It threatens those who live behind a facade. I began to realize that what scares hypocrites most is seeing someone live freely. They need everyone to remain trapped in the same fear to feel righteous. The problem is, I was no longer afraid. After growing old within that church, all I had left was time, and I decided I wouldn't waste what I had left asking for forgiveness for existing. That's when I understood. The real scandal wasn't my love, it was my courage to not hide it. When an old man like me chooses freedom, he becomes a threat. Because young people can still be molded, but an old man who has seen too much doesn't bend easily. Over time, the gossip began to turn into direct innuendo. One day, the pastor called me into his office to talk. His sweet voice no longer fooled anyone. He sat in his swivel chair, folded his hands, and said that the fellowship was concerned about my behavior. I asked what this behavior was, and he replied, "You've been getting too close to the worship guy. This has been generating unpleasant comments." I laughed because it was all so predictable that it no longer surprised me. "Comments from whom, Pastor?" I asked. He looked away and said, "From people who care about the image of God's house." I was silent for a moment and then said, "Funny. God's house should care about people, not appearances." His silence gave me the answer I already knew. That conversation wasn't a warning, it was a threat. From that moment on, everything changed. I went from being the helpful brother to becoming an example of what not to be. At each service there was a different sermon about men who go astray, secret sins, the dangers of bad company, and always in the middle of the words, a direct look at me. I endured in silence, not out of cowardice, but out of strategy, because I learned that sometimes it's better to let the venom drip dry. I saw his face, the pastor, red with rage, and wondered if he believed what he was saying. Time showed he didn't. One night, a young man, the kind who comes in full of faith and innocence, approached me outside. He said the pastor had called him to pray and that he didn't feel comfortable. His eyes were trembling. I listened silently and didn't need to ask any more questions. The story repeated itself, only this time I wasn't going to keep quiet. The following Sunday, I sat in the front row and stared at the altar from beginning to end. I wanted him to see that I knew. I wanted him to feel the same discomfort I'd always imposed on myself, and he did. His voice cracked, sweat dripped, the sermon trailed off. For the first time, he wasn't the one controlling his fear. From that day on, I understood it wasn't just about me. It was about everyone who had been silenced by people who use faith as a weapon. That temple, which once seemed like a refuge, became an arena for false saints. But I didn't walk away. I kept going, not to seek forgiveness, but to show that the truth doesn't need to be hidden. Because when a man decides not to bow his head anymore, hypocrites lose control, and nothing scares a coward more than seeing someone free. The masks began to fall one by one, and when the rot begins to stink, not even the perfume of religion can hide it. But I stayed. I stayed because I knew my silence was worth more than any of their screams. I stayed because love at my age is an act of resistance. I stayed because I still believe in a God who never needed a pulpit to exist. If you understood what I'm saying, comment. Below, hypocrisy smells. I want to know who has felt the weight of seeing people feigning purity while rotting inside. And if this excerpt made you reflect, like and share it. The more people hear this, the harder it will be for these people to continue hiding behind their faith. The following week, the news spread through the city like wildfire. They said I had been expelled from communion, that the devil had deceived me, and that I was living in public sin. Each sentence was more distorted than the last, and the curious thing was that no one approached me to ask if it was true. Those same people who once patted me on the back and called me brother now crossed the street when they saw me. I became the favorite subject of prayers, the example parents used for their children. See, this is what happens when we stray from God. What no one said was that I wasn't the one who strayed. They were the ones who pushed me out with sharp words and false smiles, and the more they attacked me, the more I realized they were afraid. Afraid not of me, but of what I represented. Because when an old man like me decides to live his own truth, he forces others to look at the lies they hide. By that time, Gabriel and I no longer went to church. We spent Sundays at home listening to old music, drinking coffee, and laughing at silly things. It was a peace I'd never known, but quiet disturbs those who don't know how to live in silence. One afternoon, a loud knock echoed at the gate. It was one of the church deacons, accompanied by two men I'd never seen before. He said the pastor wanted to have a fraternal conversation with me. I looked him straight in the eye and asked, "Fraternal or inquisitorial?" He looked away and tried to keep his tone calm, saying that the Lord could still forgive me. That made me laugh. Forgive what? Love? Grow old without pretending? I told him to take my message to the pastor. Tell him that if God wants to speak to me, he knows where to find me, and that I no longer need an intermediary. I closed the gate, and for a few seconds I stared into space. It was the first direct confrontation, and I knew that from then on things would not be quiet. That same night, I received an anonymous call. A hurried male voice said they were plotting something against me, that they were going to expose my life, prove that I was a dangerous sinner. I hung up without answering, because what they called exposure, I called liberation. But Gabriel was apprehensive. He was younger, still believed he could talk to people, that love was enough to calm the beasts. I didn't. I knew that faith and fear combined are a dangerous fuel, and deep down, they were ready to ignite. 2 days later, the inevitable happened. A video began circulating in church groups. A montage full of lies, innuendos, and out-of-context phrases. They said I seduced young men, that I corrupted the brothers. They even used old photos of me and Gabriel at a retreat, where we were simply serving lunch, to insinuate we had committed something shameful. Within hours, the video was everywhere. I heard my name spat into cell phones and whispered in the hallways. The internet had become the new pulpit, and judgment was instantaneous. At first I felt angry. Angry for years of dedication wasted. Angry at seeing Gabriel's face tremble with shame for something we never did. He wanted to leave, move to another city, start over, far away. I, on the other hand, remained calm. I told him they can take everything from us except the truth, and that's when I made a decision no one expected. The following Sunday, I put on my best shirt, sprayed on perfume, put on my old watch, and went to church, alone. I walked in the middle of the service while the pastor was still talking about false prophets and those who stray from the light. When he saw me, he gasped. The microphone made a loud noise, and for a moment the entire room stopped. I walked slowly to the front pew, sat down and stared at him. People began to whisper, some stood, others looked away. I said nothing. I just stood there, steady, breathing. The pastor tried to resume his sermon, but his voice was no longer the same. Each word seemed to carry twice as much weight. I could feel the unease in the air, as if the entire church had become too small for so much hypocrisy. When the service ended, no one approached. Some hurried past, pretending to be in a hurry. Others stared at me, as if I were a ghost. I left in silence, feeling the cold wind from the street and thinking of how many still needed to free themselves from that fear. The next morning, someone knocked on my door. It was a young man from church, the same one I'd seen harassed a while back. He was nervous, looking around, and said to me quietly, "You did what we all wanted to do, but never had the courage." That broke me inside. It was proof that my pain hadn't been in vain. I hugged him and said, "It's not courage, son, it's exhaustion. There comes a time when we get tired of being other people's favorite mistake." He cried, and so did I. In the following days, anonymous messages of support began to pour in. People I never imagined, former members, women who had been silenced, young men who had been expelled. Even a former pastor from another city wrote to say he understood every word of my gesture. And then I realized, when you speak the truth, even the silence of others becomes an echo. But the story didn't end there, because the pride of those who feed on lies can't stand losing control. 2 weeks later, I received a court notice. The pastor and the church council were suing me for defamation and public scandal. I laughed again. It was almost poetic. They who had humiliated me now wanted to officially silence me. I showed the letter to Gabriel and said, "It seems the judgment will be official now, but this time, I'll be the one standing up. If you understood what happened so far, comment I would stand up. I want to see who would have the courage to face their own hell standing up, without bowing their head to anyone. And if this excerpt touched you, like it now and share it. Because this story isn't over yet, and what comes next will show that faith, when it's true, doesn't kneel before lies." When the court order arrived, I thought it would just be another attempt to intimidate me. But they played the farce to its conclusion. The document was real, signed, stamped, full of harsh words and fabricated accusations. They said I was tarnishing the image of the church, that I was spreading lies about the pastor, that my behavior was offending the morals and good customs of the community. It was almost comical to see men who lied at the altar talking about morals. Gabriel was frightened. He said we should defend ourselves, seek a lawyer, erase any trace of the conversations we'd had. But I, for the first time in years, felt no fear. I looked at him and said, "My son, those who are not ashamed of who they are do not fear the judgment of hypocrites." This wasn't about me anymore. It was about showing that no one should be destroyed for loving. In the following days, the mood in the city grew tense. I could no longer go out to buy bread without feeling the stares on my back. Some people crossed the street, others whispered and pretended not to, but there were also those who looked at me differently, with silent respect, as if to say, "Keep going." And that's what I did. I kept going. I sought out a lawyer, a middle-aged man named Ernesto. who was known for taking on lost causes and winning. When I told my story, he was silent for a while, then said, "Your case is more than a lawsuit. It's an open wound." We scheduled the first hearing for 3 weeks later, and in the meantime, the masks began to slip even faster. Days later, Ernesto called me asking me to come to his office. He said he had gained access to documents and messages that could change the game. When I arrived, he showed me a folder full of screenshots and audio recordings. They were conversations between the pastor and other men, some explicit, others begging for silence. I gasped, not because I was surprised, but because hypocrisy now had a face and a sound. "They tried to bury you, but they forgot you have roots," Ernesto said, and for the first time in a long time, I laughed out loud. He asked me if I wanted to use that in court. I thought for a few seconds and replied, "I don't want to destroy anyone, doctor. I just want them to stop lying." News of the lawsuit spread quickly. The pastor tried to hide it, saying he was at peace, but his voice no longer held the same strength. Some worshippers began to discreetly leave. That church, once packed, now had empty rows. Fear began to shift, and it was in this vacuum that something unexpected happened. One afternoon, while I was tending my garden, a black car pulled up in front of the gate. The driver got out, and I recognized it from afar. It was the pastor himself. He came alone, without a Bible, without a mask. I almost didn't recognize him. He was haggard, with dark circles under his eyes, his suit unbuttoned. I stood still, waiting for him to speak. He took a deep breath and said, "I came to ask you to withdraw the lawsuit." I let out a short laugh, the kind that comes without permission. "Me? The lawsuit is yours, Pastor. You're the one who sued me." He lowered his head and replied, "I didn't know it would come to this." For a moment I saw the man behind the pulpit, a weary man, a prisoner of his own deception. He confessed that he had been pressured by other leaders, that the church lived on image, that any scandal could sink the ministry. He said that I had always been a good servant, and that the enemy took advantage of my weakness. I interrupted him. "My weakness, Pastor, was believing that goodness existed where there was only vanity." He remained silent. Then he looked at me with a kind of fear I had never seen before. He said he was willing to drop the lawsuit, as long as I didn't divulge anything I knew. I looked at him and asked, "What if I want to tell everything?" He stammered, tried to argue, but I continued. "Do you really think you can continue preaching love while destroying those who truly love?" He didn't answer. He got in his car and drove away. That night was long. Gabriel asked me if I would accept the deal, if I intended to let it go. I remained silent for a while and said, "I don't want revenge. I want the truth." The next day I called the lawyer and asked him to keep everything. I wanted the trial to happen. I wanted to look them in the face and tell them I couldn't live in hiding anymore. The date was set, a Friday morning at the city's central courthouse. The day dawned cold, the sky heavy. We arrived early, Gabriel, Ernesto and I. The room was full, churchgoers, curious onlookers, reporters, and in their midst, the pastor, his gaze fixed on the floor. When the judge entered, there was complete silence. The hearing lasted hours. The church's lawyer tried to paint me as a heretic, saying I was a moral agitator, that I was using faith as a political banner. I listened in silence until the judge gave me the floor. I stood up slowly, rested my hands on the table and said, "Your Honor, I'm not here to discuss religion. I'm here to defend the right to be who I am without being treated like a criminal. I was humiliated, slandered, called an old faggot in a church where they only preach love. What I did that was so wrong was loving another man, and loving isn't a crime." There was a murmur in the room. I continued, "Those who accuse me are the same ones who sin in secret and hide behind the cross. I didn't come here to destroy anyone's faith. I came to remind them that God doesn't belong to a group, but to those who live in truth." When I finished, the courtroom fell silent. The judge called a recess. And during that break, the pastor hurried out without looking at anyone. I later learned that he'd taken a leave of absence from his post and left town. The case hadn't been ruled on yet, but I knew that, in a way, I'd already won. It wasn't a court victory. It was the victory of someone who had finally stopped apologizing for existing. If you've made it this far, I want you to write in the comments, "The truth doesn't keep silent." That's the phrase that sums it all up. And if this part of the story caught your attention, leave a like now, because what happened after this trial was something no one expected, not even me. After the hearing, I thought the dust would settle. I thought the silence would return, that the city would tire of the scandal and move on. But I underestimated the power of hatred disguised as faith. For the first few days, everything seemed too calm. No phone calls, no threats, no familiar faces at the door, until the notes started. Small, folded pieces of paper, left under the gate with sentences written in crooked letters. Shame on the city. You will pay. God sees everything. Sometimes they were accompanied by torn Bible pages, marked with verses about sin and destruction. I didn't respond. I threw them away and tried to go about my daily routine, but deep inside I felt the warning. This wasn't over yet. One night, the noise came differently. A dull sound, like something breaking. When I went outside, I saw the gate covered in red paint. They'd written abomination in large letters like a sentence. Gabriel was shocked. He wanted to call the police, but I asked for calm. I've lived long enough to know that the worst enemy is the one who hides behind faith. What they wanted wasn't to destroy the house, but to destroy what it represented. Two men living in peace, after all. And that's what bothers moralists most, to see someone they swore was inferior still standing. In the following days, the undercover visits began. Women from the church came to stand me up, but they looked inside the house like someone inspecting a crime scene. Men knocked on the door offering prayers, but they just wanted to see if I was alone. One of them even said, "There's still time to repent." I replied, "Time, my brother, is what we lose when we live lying." He didn't know what to say. He left with a red face, like someone seeing himself in a mirror for the first time. But what no one expected happened a week later. A news crew showed up at the front of the house. They said they wanted to hear my side of the story. At first I hesitated. They'd already distorted the truth so much that I wasn't sure it was worth it. But something inside me told me this was my chance to speak directly, without a filter. I asked for a few minutes, fixed my hair, put on a clean shirt, and agreed to record. The interview began simply, with questions about the trial, the church, and my life. But as I spoke, I realized the reporter wasn't expecting the serenity of an old man. He expected anger, scandal, resentment, and what I gave was calm. I said, "I've spent my whole life trying to be accepted by people who don't even accept themselves. Now I don't need to anymore. The love I've found doesn't distance me from God. It brings me closer." The interview aired 2 days later, and what happened was something no one, including me, anticipated. Within hours, my story began to spread across the internet. Messages of support came from everywhere, from people I'd never met, from other older men who'd carried the same fear I'd carried my entire life, from women who'd also been rejected by the church for loving the wrong way. A man from Portugal wrote that he cried after listening to my talk. A woman from rural Brazil shared that her father, a man in his 70s, decided to come out after watching. It hit me deeply. It was as if, for the first time, my pain had served to free someone. Of course, along with the support came hate, the harshest. Comments were always accompanied by Bible verses. "Hell awaits you. You are living proof of decay. Disgusting old man." But now it was different. I no longer felt fear or shame. I read, breathed, and thought, anyone who speaks so hatefully of love has never truly felt it. And each message of support weighed more heavily than 100 insults. Gabriel hugged me and said, "I think you've unintentionally become a symbol." I laughed. "Not a symbol, my son. I've just become what I've always been, a man tired of hiding." The repercussion grew so much that the case made headlines again. Lawyer Ernesto called me excitedly, saying the video of the interview had over 500,000 views. "The whole country is talking about you, my friend." I smiled, but remained silent. It wasn't vanity. It was a kind of peace mixed with disbelief. I'd spent so many years being invisible that it hurt to realize that all I had to do was tell the truth to be heard. But with visibility came danger. On a cold Friday night, someone threw a rock at the living room window. The glass shattered and the noise sent Gabriel running from the room. We didn't see who did it. We only heard a car engine revving and driving away. Taped to the wall was a note. "Shut your mouth." I sat on the couch, took a deep breath and told him, "What they don't understand is that no stone can silence someone who's been stoned inside." The next day we went to the police station to file a report. The officer, a young man, listened to everything in silence. Finally he looked at me and said, "My grandfather was like you. He died without the courage to speak out. You did what he never could." After that, there was no turning back. My story became the subject of programs, debates, and articles. They called it "The Case of the Old Man from the Church." I laughed at that expression because deep down, that's exactly what it was. An old man who once believed in people more than himself and learned too late that true faith begins when lies end. Gabriel said I should take advantage of it, write a book, give lectures, but I didn't want the stage. I just wanted to keep drinking my coffee, planting my flowers, and sleeping with a light heart. But life still had a surprise in store. One Monday morning the phone rang. It was a female voice, soft, slightly shaky. She introduced herself as the mother of one of the boys who attended the church. She said her son had disappeared after the scandal, and that, before disappearing, she had left a letter mentioning my name. Her voice trembled, and each word sounded like a cry for help. I asked her to come to my house. When she arrived, she handed me the letter, folded in four. The paper was crumpled, with tear stains. In the first line she wrote, "If it weren't for that man, I wouldn't have discovered that love isn't a disease." That sentence struck me like a bolt of lightning. I sat up slowly, unable to speak. He was a boy I remembered seeing in the back. Rows of church, always quiet, his eyes filled with fear, and now he was gone. What happened to him would be the beginning of a new chapter no one was prepared to hear, not even me. If you've made it this far, write in the comments, "Love is not a disease." I want to see who understood what this story conveys. Leave a like to support this kind of content, because what follows will reveal something that could change everything you thought about what really happened after that day. When I read that letter, I felt the ground disappear beneath my feet. The boy's shaky writing seemed to scream, as if each word had been written with tears and courage. He spoke of loneliness, fear, and shame. He said he tried to pray for change, but that each prayer left him feeling emptier. "I asked God to heal me," he wrote, "and he answered me by showing me that I had never been sick." Those words rang in my head like an unending echo. His mother looked at me with teary eyes, trying to understand why her son, such a quiet boy, had disappeared, leaving nothing behind but that piece of paper. I promised to help find him. I didn't know how, but I knew I couldn't pretend nothing had happened. Over the next few days, I began to mentally replay every moment I'd seen him at church. I remembered him sitting in the back pew, always with his head down, looking away when someone stared at him for too long. He was the kind of boy who went unnoticed, which in that church meant being safe, until the wrong people noticed. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized something was off. Before he disappeared, he'd always been close to one of the youth leaders, a respected married man with a reputation for saving lost souls. The same reputation others used as a shield to do whatever they wanted, hidden from the congregation. I knew the pattern. I'd seen it before many times. I told lawyer Ernesto everything, and he advised me to file a missing person report, mentioning the young man's name and the possible involvement of that leader. When I arrived at the police station, the chief listened attentively and at the end let out a heavy sigh. He said it wasn't the first case involving that church, but that no one had ever had the courage to pursue it. "People are afraid to mess with people who claim to be God," he said, "but you seem to be afraid of nothing anymore." I simply replied, "Those who have been crucified alive no longer fear the nail." He wrote down the report, and I left with a strange feeling, a mixture of hope and revulsion. 2 days later, I received an anonymous message. "Stop looking for the boy. This isn't your problem." The number was unidentified, but the tone echoed the threats I'd already heard. I showed the message to Gabriel, who was concerned, but I was already determined. That boy's story wasn't going to end quietly like so many others. So I began discreetly asking questions. I went to the homes of some young people who attended the church, visited acquaintances, and asked neighbors. Most of them avoided the call, but one of them, a shy young man, eventually told me that the missing boy had last been seen leaving late at night in one of the deacon's cars. "They fought," he said, "because the pastor found out." That struck a chord. The same pastor who preached morality, who called me an old faggot, who sued me. He knew everything and covered it up. With this information, I returned to the police station. The chief urged patience, saying he would investigate, but I knew that if I didn't push the truth forward, it would be buried. That's when I sought out the same reporter who had interviewed me months earlier. I showed him the letter, told him what I knew, and he was shocked. He said it could become a national scandal, and it did. In less than a week, the report aired, with my face on the screen again, but now alongside the story of the missing boy. They showed excerpts from the letter, interviews with former church members, and even anonymous screenshots of conversations between the boy and the leader. The whole country heard about it. The repercussions were enormous. Social media was divided between those calling me a hero and those saying I was the devil disguised as a victim. The investigation moved quickly after the report. They found the leader's car parked in an abandoned lot a few kilometers from the city. Inside were burned clothes, a partially destroyed cell phone, and a bracelet that the boy's mother immediately recognized. The leader denied everything, but the evidence began to mount. When the police went to his home, they found messages, photos, and recordings that revealed an entire network of abuse within the church, covered up for years. It was as if a curtain had been ripped back, revealing the rot hidden behind the hymns and prayers. And while everyone was talking, while the newspapers reported every detail, I only thought about that boy, about what he must have felt before he disappeared. Gabriel watched me silently. He knew all of this affected me deeply. I spent hours sitting in the backyard, staring into space, thinking about how many others had been silenced, how many were still trapped in shame, fear, and guilt. This was no longer about faith nor scandal, it was about justice. Ernesto called me the next day, saying that with the new evidence, my case would be automatically dismissed. The irony was that in the same court that tried to convict me, they were now judging the same men who had pointed the finger at me, and once again, without me having to say a word, the truth spoke for me. One cold morning, the boy's mother returned to my house. She hugged me tightly, without saying a word. We stood there, two survivors of the same storm. She thanked me for not letting her son's story die, and before leaving she said, "You've given meaning back to the word faith." After she left, I sat on the porch and cried. I cried for her, for him, for myself, and for everyone still trapped in a fear that wasn't theirs. But something told me it wasn't over yet, and I was right. That same night, I received a call that would change everything. It was the police chief. He said they'd found a recording on the young man's cell phone, something he'd left on purpose, perhaps as a final message. And in that recording, there was something no one expected, something involving people who were still preaching every Sunday. When I hung up the phone, my heart raced. I knew what was coming wouldn't be easy to hear. If you've made it this far, write in the comments, "The truth always comes back." I want to see who understands the weight of that phrase. Leave a like now, because what follows will reveal a secret that not only changed the history of that church, but also the course of everything I believed about faith, love, and justice. When the police chief called me saying he'd found a recording on the boy's cell phone, I felt my body freeze. It wasn't fear, it was the kind of feeling that only appears when the truth is about to tear through the veil of lies. I went to the police station that same night. The hallway was empty, the sound of my footsteps echoing against the white walls. The police chief greeted me with a serious look, the kind that says it all without needing words. He placed the cell phone on the table, adjusted the volume, and said, "You need to hear this." I sat up slowly. The sound began with heavy breathing, then a trembling voice. It was the boy. He said, "If I disappear, it's because they don't want the truth to come out." Then a long pause, followed by a sentence that chilled my blood. "Pastor Elias and the deacons are buying everyone's silence. They think no one will have the courage to speak out, but someone does." The recording continued, each word heavier than the last. He mentioned names, places, days, described secret meetings, hidden payments, threats. There were passages with the laughter of men who claimed to be saints, plans to silence anyone who spoke. The boy knew too much, and now I understood why he had disappeared. When the audio ended, the silence in the room seemed to scream. The police chief took a deep breath and said, "With this material, things change. This is a network, and you, sir, unintentionally opened the hornet's nest." I stood there, staring into space, my head spinning. Everything I had experienced up until that point, the insults, the trial, the threats, were not just isolated attacks. They were part of a system sustained by omission and fear. In the following days, the recording leaked. No one knows how, but within hours it was all over the internet. Pastor Elias's name appeared in national headlines. The church was closed, its leaders arrested, and the city plunged into moral chaos. The people who had previously pointed their fingers at me now hid behind silence. I would go out on the street and see familiar faces crossing to the other side, no longer out. To have contempt, but out of shame. That building that once echoed hymns became a symbol of decay. But for me, there was no relief, because in the midst of all that confusion, the boy had still not been found. The nights were long again. I would wake to the sound of the wind hitting the window and imagine his face, the look of fear, the shaky letter. Gabriel tried to calm me, telling me I had done my part, that now it was the justice system's job, but I couldn't rest. I knew there was something more. When the lie is too big, there's always a piece of truth trying to escape, and that piece began to appear unexpectedly. One morning, I received a message on my cell phone from an unknown number. It simply said, "He's alive." I froze. My heart raced. I responded immediately, but the message didn't deliver. It seemed like it came from a ghost. I showed it to Gabriel, who thought it might be a trap, and the police chief asked me not to respond. But something inside me told me the message was real. 2 days later, an envelope appeared in the mailbox. No return address, no postmark. Inside was a photo. The boy, thin, with a tired face, but alive. Behind the photo, a handwritten phrase, "Don't stop now." It was the same handwriting as the letter. I trembled. I showed it to the police chief, who was speechless. He said the investigation pointed to something bigger, that some of those involved had connections to local politicians and business people. It was a web of power, and the boy had been used as currency. The police chief warned me to be careful, that I was at the center of something beyond anyone's imagination. That night, the fear returned, but it was a different kind. Not the kind that paralyzes, but the kind that gives meaning to the fight. Gabriel and I decided to leave the city for a few days while the police continued their search. We went to a simple house belonging to a friend of his in the countryside. There, away from the noise, I could breathe, but the silence brought back memories. I kept thinking about how many young people had gone through that, how many had been silenced before anyone could hear them, and I realized that the fight wasn't just for that boy, it was for all those still alive, but trapped inside the same hell. A week later, the phone rang. It was the police chief. He asked me to return to town. He said they'd found the boy. My heart nearly leaped out of my chest. "Is he okay?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Yes, but there's something. You need to know." I returned that same day. When I arrived at the police station, I saw the boy sitting, wrapped in a blanket, his eyes distant. He looked like a war survivor. When he saw me, he slowly got up and walked toward me. We hugged in silence. I felt his body tremble, but I also felt something else. Gratitude. After a few minutes, he told me everything. He'd been kidnapped by 2 of the deacons, taken to a remote farm, and threatened not to turn anyone in. He managed to escape in the middle of the night, hiding in abandoned houses until he found someone willing to help him. He said he only decided to turn himself in when he saw the repercussions of the recording on TV. "I thought you needed to know I'm alive," he said, his voice hoarse. I couldn't answer. I just squeezed his hands and let the tears speak. But what he said next was unexpected. Before fleeing, he overheard conversations between the men. They talked about me, about Gabriel, about a plan to silence us once, and, for all, they were afraid we knew too much. He said that one of them, the same one who served me with the court order months ago, was the one coordinating everything. The church, the money, the silence, everything went through him. And in that moment I understood. I wasn't safe yet. The police chief assured me of police protection, but deep down I knew the kind of security I needed couldn't be bought with an escort. It was a matter of faith, not the kind they preached, but the kind born when we face hell and keep walking. If you've made it this far, it's because this story touched you in some way, and I want to ask you something simple but very important to me. Leave your like now. This shows YouTube that this type of content needs to reach more people. Take advantage and subscribe to the channels, or you don't miss the next stories coming out, each one more intense and surprising than the last. And if you stayed until the end, comment below with the sentence, "I don't keep silent." This way, I will know who is part of our community, who understands the weight of the truth and has the courage to listen to the end. And before you leave, don't forget, next video, it's already appearing on the screen. Click now and stay with me, because the next story is one of those that no one will believe really happened.